Okay, time to get the show on the road. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope all is well. First, I'd like to thank everyone who took time off their schedules to join this webinar this morning. I guarantee that this is time well invested. I'd like to thank everyone who took time off their schedules to join this webinar this morning. I guarantee that this is time well invested. I'm hearing a bit of feedback on my side. But I think I'll just continue. I'm not sure if this is affecting everybody.
We can hear you, Monteiro. Maybe you can just continue.
Okay, can be fine. So this is the 8th webinar in this cycle today, and we are truly honored. Okay, great. So this is the 8th webinar in this cycle today, and we are truly honored to have a wealth of knowledge and experience that is Dr. Pedro Monteiro talking to us this morning. The name Pedro has Spanish origins, but its English meaning has been elevated to rock or stone. It goes without saying that Pedro has and will continue to be the cornerstone of Southern Ocean carbon climate research in South Africa today and well into the future. His colleagues and understudies, some of whom I have been fortunate to spend some time with on board the SIR Gallas 2 research vessel, speak of him with boundless honor and deep respect. I too have been fortunate to meet him a couple of times, and I can confirm that he is an all-round incredible leader and a great human being. Having earned his PhD in 1982, Dr. Pedro Monteiro is now Chief Oceanographer at CSIR in South Africa, where he heads the Southern Ocean Carbon Climate Observatory, SOCCO. He has a special interest in understanding how ocean physics explains the seasonal to decadal variability and trends in ocean carbon dioxide under climate variability and change in the Southern Ocean. The design of novel long-term ocean observing strategies linked to machine learning and numerical models are key interests. These efforts contribute to reducing uncertainty in fully coupled Earth system models and long-term projections of climate. He's currently a coordinating lead author for the carbon chapter in the AR6 Working Group 1 and a member of the JSC of the WCRP. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Pedro Monteiro. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for those kind words. I'm just a bit concerned, is the feedback still coming through to everyone, or is it clear from your side?
It's all clear, Prof. Go ahead.
Okay. Great. So let me start off, first of all, by thanking the CHPC for inviting me, and by inviting me, they're inviting the whole of SOCCO to share with you what is it exactly that SOCCO has been doing while hanging around Rosebank for the past 10 years, you know. And so actually it's a good moment. It's a good moment for two reasons. Well, many reasons, but two that sort of jump out immediately are that it's actually overdue that SOCCO really acknowledges the impact that this 10-year relationship with CHPC has had in making the science that we do possible. You know, it's been an essential component, and it keeps on, and that the complexity of that relationship keeps on growing as we in SOCCO develop our science and the numerical platforms on which our science depends. So I just like to sort of put that up front and say, without CHPC, we would not be able to be sharing the kind of success that we've had in the past 10 years. So on behalf of everyone, thank you. Secondly, it's also, from a personal point of view, a very important moment. A bit sad, but not when I think that it's actually, you know, it's from the perspective that this is my last formal month at CSIR. Not a bit sad, very sad. Particularly because of the fantastic work that we've done together. But also, not so much so, because in fact, particularly over the past 10 years that SOCCO has really been around, 12 years now, I suppose. You know, I just think back of how much we have achieved, how much we have grown. And I hope that this presentation gives a sense of that. I'm not going to name anyone because, you know, once you start to name people, the problem becomes, oh, who do you leave out? You know, the ones that are not are left out. So, you know, everyone who we've interacted with has played a critical role and a really important role in making this possible. Now, in thinking about today's talk, I kind of figured that I was not going to give you a complete dive into all of SOCCO's science. I have focused mainly on the bits of our science that have had have depended particularly on the CHPC relationship. And but having said, I'm not going to name anyone. I do want to mention one particular member of the SOCCO team who has been really instrumental in really making the connection with CHPC work from a technical, engineering, software, and all dimensions, and that's Nicolette Chang. You know, it's really, I think a lot of what I'm talking about today is, in one way or other, connects to her effort. So we really acknowledge that as well. Okay, so SOCCO is a team. So I'm here talking on behalf of that team. And SOCCO is an interdisciplinary, and in a sense that we connect physics, chemistry, and biology into understanding the Earth system, particularly the way the Southern Ocean, the role that the Southern Ocean plays in the carbon climate, global climate, carbon climate system. So the name actually encapsulates exactly what our long-term goal is. And the Carbon Climate Observatory is a key part of that name. The observatory is not just about observations, but that we integrate observations and modeling. So hence the role of the CHPC and in what we do. So a quick overview. I'm going to spend a few minutes giving you a bit of, so I think for a lot of you, the ocean, and particularly the Southern Ocean and its role in global climate system is not entirely clear. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking around that. So it's really about why are we doing this and why do we care? Secondly, we'll sort of start, then we're going to look at 3 dimensions of what we do that are really have been almost completely driven by the relationship with the CHPC. One is really about our models and modeling development to address the process scale challenges that we have. The second one is really looking at using our observations to reconstructing regional and global maps and time series from our observations, just in a way, let's call it a gap filling approach, using machine learning. And those machine learning models and the way we've used them have been dependent strongly on the CHPC. And thirdly, which is kind of really sort of at the work which is still at its inception, is in another sort of big data aspect, where our colleagues who are concerned about the biological role in carbon fluxes are using remote sensing based reconstructions of ocean productivity and carbon export eventually, using biooptical algorithms. So this is a quick sort of overview of SOCCO, and it's really a map about showing how SOCCO is structured so that it goes from basic science to societal impact. And on the left side is the societal benefit, the right side is the scientific discovery. Starting from the top, the observations, data product, technological innovation, enabling analysis, modeling, and system understanding, which then support improving the climate and Earth system models that are used for climate prediction and climate risk assessment. And all that then supports, doesn't feed into, but supports national and international policy, and that policy includes both government and business. CHPC is involved in all the blocks that have SOCCO on them, just to give you a sense. So why are carbon climate feedbacks, the variability and trends in Southern Ocean carbon so important? I mean, there's of course this could be a detailed seminar all in its own, but really at the bottom part of it, and that's what I hope to show a little bit of our contribution that we've made around this, is that the Southern Ocean plays a critical role in understanding the coupled carbon climate system, global climate carbon system. The Southern Ocean is also really important for regional climate, and that's particularly around winter rainfall, and that affects South Africa in two important dimensions. One is that for those of us in the Western Cape, we know it very well, our winter rains. But something that is often not well appreciated is that those winter rains generate the snow that supplies the Lesotho Highlands water scheme that supplies water to Gauteng. So understanding the coupled ocean atmosphere system in the Southern Hemisphere is really important to South African science. And SOCCO is making a contribution in that direction. Finally, South Africa has a comparative geographical advantage. We are on the edge of the Southern Ocean. And for us, it's actually an opportunity to use that comparative advantage to make a contribution to global science, and in doing that, create circumstances that enable us to train very excellent South African scientists in the skills that are needed for the coming century, actually. Yeah. So this is what the global carbon cycle looks like. I'm not going to go into all the details of it. So this is the land on the right-hand side, the ocean on the left-hand side, the atmosphere in the middle. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, with a stroke of the button, remove the land. So this is just to highlight you know, why are we concerned about this? So if we talk, can you see my cursor?
Yes, we can see.
We can see it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so our anthropogenic CO2 emissions go into the atmosphere, and in the atmosphere, once they are in the atmosphere, strong negative feedbacks from the ocean and the land draw down part of those emissions and leave in the atmosphere what's called the airborne fraction, which is the bit that's not taken up by the ocean and the atmosphere and the land. And that's the bit that is driving the heat imbalance, which is driving climate change, which drives the climate feedbacks that go back into the ocean and the land as well. So what's important is that this negative feedback here is the way the ocean and the land have been slowing down the rate of global warming and subsequent climate change. So, but the problem is that this negative feedback depends on an ongoing capability of the ocean, in our case, to continue to do that. And what we do know is that the Southern Ocean plays a very dominant, and I hope to explain to you in a minute how it does that. But the emergence of positive feedbacks is something which is of great concern to us globally, and of course in our research in the Southern Ocean. And our use of machine learning models and prognostic models in the CHPC plays a critical role in understanding the contribution that the Southern Ocean plays in today's negative feedbacks and the changes that in the future around the positive and negative feedbacks, and depending on, of course, the emission scenario that we're in. So these feedbacks are what's called carbon concentration feedbacks. So they are the concentrations that are related to changes in the carbon in the ocean system. The carbon climate feedbacks are the ones that feed back through the radiative forcing of CO2 in the atmosphere, changing climate that then changes the ocean circulation. Okay, so those are carbon climate feedbacks and carbon concentration feedbacks. So this is a figure that I borrowed from my colleague in Paris from a talk that he gave, which is a really nice figure. That now it really summarizes what I was saying in one simple expression, that the change in temperature, i.e. global warming, which is the heat imbalance, is driven by the difference between the radiative forcing, which is the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere after the ocean and land sinks have removed their component, minus the heat that's stored in the ocean. And I'm going to leave out the climate feedbacks right now because their influence, as it says here, is about modulation. So we're focusing on this little part of the expression. The radiative forcing is very dependent on the fraction of these are the emissions here. And you can see here, these emissions are distributed in terms of the ocean uptake, the land uptake, and what's left in the atmosphere. So the radiative forcing here is what's left in the atmosphere here. But of course, the ocean is playing a key role by taking this component and making this radiative forcing smaller than it would otherwise be. And what you can see is that of this important role of the ocean, this is the impact of the Southern Ocean, that it accounts for somewhere, here it says 40%, it's somewhere between 40 and 50% of the total ocean uptake of anthropogenic CO2 is done in the Southern Ocean. Now, more broadly speaking, our planet remains habitable because the ocean is capable of taking up this amount of heat and CO2. All of this excess heat, this radiative forcing that's is produced, over 90% is taken up by the ocean. So global warming is actually being driven by a very small residual of the net heat that remains in the atmosphere. And an adjunct to that is the effect of the ocean uptake of CO2. Now, there's something that's also important to understand here, is that CO2 is a unique gas. There is no other gas that has the properties of CO2 in water, particularly in seawater. And that has to do with the carbon electron structure. But for example, to give you a sense of it, the ocean has a concentration of 10 to 20 times more higher of CO2 relative to oxygen, for example. And that has to do with the fact that CO2 is not just dissolved as a gas, but stored in the ocean as a salt as well. That capacity of being able to change from being stored as a gas and salt is what makes CO2 match heat in terms of maintaining the stability of global climate. And our objective in SOCCO is to understand what role the Southern Ocean plays in understanding that relationship and what are the mechanisms, how susceptible are they to global warming and climate change. So these are all the questions that we are interested in. So just a sort of visual example of now starting to look at the Southern Ocean. This is where CO2 exchanges with the atmosphere in the Southern Ocean. And you can see that north of the polar front, there's a net uptake of CO2. South of the polar front is actually an outgassing, which is natural. And this has been happening even before the industrial period. So changes in both of them are critical. On the right-hand side is where does this CO2, anthropogenic CO2 that's taken up by the Southern Ocean, where does it go? And you can see that it's being stored in the ocean interior in what we call the subtropical or thermocline waters of the Atlantic and Indian Ocean, particularly. So you can see, and you can see that here on the right-hand side, that the Southern Ocean, this is looking at from the Southern Hemisphere to the Northern Hemisphere. This is a section through the ocean interior. And what you can see here is the importance of the Southern Ocean in driving. So this storage is actually this component of storage. And you can see that anthropogenic CO2 is now being stored to over 1,000 meters depth. And here's the equivalent heat storage. And you can see how close they are. And so it's this comparability which is really important and interesting, in the sense that they look the same, but they're not exactly the same, and the mechanisms are different, so their climate sensitivities are different. That's one of the things that we have to understand more through observations and modeling. Another aspect of the importance of the Southern Ocean is, I just want to focus on this top left-hand side. This is the variability from a whole bunch of different products. The variability, the decadal variability from the early 90s to 2016 of CO2 fluxes in the ocean, the global ocean. This is the global mean. And what you can see is a sort of a decadal, a quasi-decadal mode here. In other words, the flux weakens and then strengthens. Now, when you look at all the other components of the ocean, the one that dominates this quasi-decadal mode is the Southern Ocean. So this global variability is predominantly driven by the Southern Ocean. Okay, so let's start to dive in now. So SOCCO science has a niche that we formulated right at the beginning, and that is that if we want to understand large-scale variability and trends in carbon and climate, we have to understand fine-scale processes that are happening. So the large-scale processes I refer to here are the sort of years to basin scale, 10,000 kilometers kind of scale. But in order to understand this scale, we have to understand these fine scales, which are happening on hours to weeks and 1 to 100 kilometers. So this is probably the most important modeling challenge we have, for example, and this refers to CHPC, because it requires models to be very high resolution. So the idea, and climate models typically leave out the fine scale. And SOCCO started off with this science niche, asking the question, what are we missing out at that by not including these scales? 12 years ago, this was not a widely accepted idea and somewhat controversial. It's become far less so now. So here we have a figure in which I want to illustrate these points. This is a figure which has a kind of semi-logarithmic figures with the spatial scales going from 1 to 10,000 kilometers on the x-axis, and the temporal scales going from hours to decades, and it could be centuries. Large-scale climate, i.e. the big scale, sits on this end of this time-space domain. Our understanding of large-scale circulation, both in the atmosphere and in the ocean, is actually, and as explaining climate variability and climate trends, is really on these, in this kind of time-space bubble, which is the sort of the weeks to decades, century, and so climate models that have to do long-term projections, that is, for millennia, actually, multiple decades and centuries, have to be cannot resolve dynamics that are happening on scales that are less shorter than 100 kilometers without a huge computational overhead. And that is a dilemma, because actually, in order to understand how this part of the system works, you have to understand this part of the system. And that is what I call this a non-steady state dynamics. And this is the computational overhead challenge that we have in order to be able to predict climate risk with a sufficient degree of confidence. So, but the reality is that climate models are limited to this scale. And the consequences of that are evident in this analysis, which comes from Precious Mongwe, who's also joined us recently in SOCCO, and he did his PhD with me. It ended in 2018, and these results here, which are actually updated to the most recent Earth system models, show an important feature of why we're doing this and why the Southern Ocean is important. Is that when you compare these different Earth system models to observations are the black lines in each one of them, you find that the models and the observations agree pretty well in most parts of the ocean, except the Southern Ocean. And in fact, in the Southern Ocean, the Earth system models split into two groups that are completely out of phase with each other. And our hypothesis is that the reason for that lies because these processes are absent in the models. It's not the only reason. There are also process parameterization aspects, but I'm not going to touch on those right now. So, in order to address this, we started to take an approach to models and modeling that did not come from the large-scale models. We said, well, actually, in order to do this, we have to come to grips with the fine-scale dynamics, and we have to have modeling capabilities that address and allow us to examine these fine-scale dynamics and actually ultimately link them with observation. SOCCO, an important part of SOCCO science is that we integrate models with observations. a good starting point is this. So we developed a hierarchy of models, which went from global scale, coarse resolution, typical resolution of climate models, to very high resolution models, which because of computational limitations have to be sub-regional. And this gives you, this table here gives you a sense of, for each one of these resolutions, what's the number of grid points in them, how the number of grid points vary, and the use of CPUs to do for the runs. And you can see how the 200-kilometer resolution run, which is global, with just less than 1 million grid points, can run fairly on a modest demand of CPUs. But when we go to a 10-kilometer resolution model, which is just circumpolar, not global, with 208 million grid points, it requires just under 2,000 CPUs to run effectively. So this balance between, we would like to run a 10-kilometer global model, but that is at the moment not possible. So the question is, how do we actually overcome this? And I'll come to that a bit later. So this is another description of those, of the sort of hierarchical approach that we have in terms of the different models that allow us to run experiments that are specific to those scales in order to test our ideas. And so we use these, for example, high resolution models to design some of our observational experiments, and then we use those outputs to verify the model dynamics. So to give you, this is an example, to give you an idea of how important resolution is in providing the understanding that we need for the dynamics that drive that coupling between the ocean and the atmosphere in the Southern Ocean, and by extension, how the Southern Ocean influences global climate through both CO2 and heat. Now, this is using what we call a seasonal cycle reproducibility, and it's actually a pretty simple concept. So what it means is the correlation between the mean seasonal cycle of CO2 in this case over a period of 10 years, a bit more than 10 years in this case, and that's the blue line, and the correlation that it has to the CO2 annual cycle for each one of those years. Of course, this is taken from a particular location in each one of these maps. This is the low resolution 200-kilometer Nemo-Piscis model. This is the 50-kilometer resolution model, and this is the 10-kilometer resolution. And what you see here, which is extremely important, is a gradual decrease in the correlation of the seasonal cycle reproducibility as you increase the resolution, because the high resolution model is starting to capture ocean dynamics that are variable on an intra-seasonal variability scale. And that is really, so the response of the ocean to storms is starting to become much more evident in the high resolution model. And that's the blue color here relative to the low resolution model. Now, this is extremely important because it probably accounts for most of the exchange of heat and CO2 between the ocean and the atmosphere. And in doing this, we want to not just explain why we need to include these processes in the large-scale climate models, but also start to explore ways of doing that in taking approaches that are both computationally efficient, but also maintain the rigor of the underlying processes. So we'll come back to that in a minute. This is another example of the same picture, which is sort of going from the low resolution on the left-hand side, that's summer on the top line and winter in the lower line. And you can see what effect resolution has going down to 3 kilometers, in this case, what effect it has on the gradients. Now, gradients in the ocean are extremely important because they reflect areas that play a much bigger, have a much bigger weight in the processes that drive that heat CO2 exchange. So capturing these scales in those models is the challenge. So here, this is an example of where we varied the intensity of wind stress, tau. When the wind stress was greater than 10 meters per second, we ran experiments when we increased the power of storms by increasing the wind stress by 1.5, decreasing it by 1/2. And that's for the 50-kilometer model and comparing it to the 3-kilometer model. And just look at the magnitude of the response to the same changes in the winds. So there's an order of magnitude amplification of the flux of CO2 in the very fine scale models. So we go to the challenge of, so this is a very important collaboration that we have with Francois Engelbrecht, originally at CSIR and now at WITS, at the Global Change Institute, in which we are working with the development of the South African Earth System model, which is quite an interesting approach, different to most other Earth System models, in the sense that it uses quite a very non-linear architecture that allows us to vary the resolution globally. And that's important because typically most Earth System models perform quite well in the Northern Hemisphere, but quite poorly in the Southern Hemisphere. So what we're doing, we're taking our learning from the work that we're doing through SOCCO at the CHPC and looking at ways of bringing those sub-grid scale dynamics into the South African Earth System model to enable it to improve the biases that these kind of models have in the Southern Hemisphere. So this is an example of how we're doing this, and this is a slide for one of our PhD students, Zakina Hursam, and she's taking a machine learning approach to this. So at its sort of simplest level, we want to avoid this very highly expensive resolution-driven approach to capture the high resolution, the subgrid scale dynamics in the ocean, which are, in other words, resolving those processes explicitly. And what she is doing in her PhD is exploring a machine learning approach, which may be supervised or unsupervised learning approaches to parameterize the subgrid scale dynamics and be able to recapture those dynamics from that kind of resolution. So this is in terms of the CHPC, we're looking at the sort of the computational power of the CHPC, but also both the access to both CPU and GPU clusters. Particularly the GPU clusters are offering some really interesting possibilities. So the issue of also running Python interactively on the grid is also on the cluster is critical. So now looking at a second aspect of the questions of scale, which is really looking at the observations. So here's another version of the earlier diagram of space and time. Sorry, now the two axes are swapped around. And once again, you can see that here, this is where the climate questions need to be answered because it's a big scale planetary climate questions. However, most observations are happening in terms of ships, are happening on the large scale, spatial scale, but very, ships observe where ships are. So they are only able to observe instantaneously. So ships are very good in space, but bad in time, whereas moorings are very good in time, but very bad in space, in the sense they are fixed. Okay, this is an example of a mooring. So what we had 10 years ago was this scale chasm between the large scale processes and the fine scale dynamics that we needed to observe. And in order to do that, we started to implement, we pioneered the use of ocean robotics to close this scale gap. Now, I'm going to leave the ocean robotics out of this for now, and just to say that before the introduction of ocean robotics, and ocean robotics are to this day still very experimental, the backbone of turning ship observations into maps that link up to this large scale are machine learning reconstructions. So this is what ship-based observations in the ocean look like at the moment. Historically, this is from 2010 to 2017. So what really jumps at one is the fact, the contrast between the Northern Hemisphere, these are CO2 observations, between the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. The colors indicate the number of months that are covered. And in most of the Southern Hemisphere, not only are there big spatial gaps, but also most of the observations are made in no more than 2 months of the year. And this is really highlighted in this figure on the right-hand side, where you can see the distribution or the density of observations for all year round in the Southern Ocean, and what they look like if you just look at winter. And you can see, well, this is a major challenge. So what we did is we on the back of international developments in using machine learning to reconstruct ocean CO2, we developed a reasonable, sort of independent and high resolution approach through the PhD of Luke Greger, which some of you may remember. And this approach, just sort of very quickly, it's a kind of a two-step approach to turn these sparse observations into CO2 maps. And what the two steps are: the setting up of regressions of each one of these CO2 observations against variables that can be observed by satellites. Satellites, of course, remote sensing covers the entire area. So then what we do is we break up the Southern Ocean into what are called clusters, biomes. They've got different names. And they allow, the assumption there is they allow us to take a regression, for example. We may only have one regression in this part of the cluster, and we applied the same regression to the rest of the cluster. And what we're able to do is use the satellite data to fill the gaps in these in the Southern Ocean, the gaps in space and the gaps in time. And these are the kind of maps that we get, and these are the sort of, you can see the sort of now starting to resolve the seasonal cycle of CO2 in a multi-decadal timescale. And this is some of one of the first publications, and in fact, Luke won the prize for the best PhD in the science faculty for this work at UCT. So this work actually went on, and just a sort of quick aside, that this of course this work completely depended on the collaboration that we have with the CHPC, because the running of these models on the CHPC was critical. So this work was then instrumental in our contribution to the IPCC 6th assessment report. So out of the Luke's PhD came this, what is now one of the 6 global ocean CO2 flux products, and the CSIR ML6, which is 6 ensemble machine learning model. And this is one of the 6 global products that is used to constrain the global ocean CO2 flux. And this is important for 2 reasons. One is it's used, as it is in this figure here, to do a comparison against the model runs, the models being the black line and the blue being the the machine learning products. Secondly, it enabled us to provide an improved constraint to the global carbon budget. And this is really important because, of course, all the decisions that are being made around calculating remaining carbon emissions, etc., are based on the precision and accuracy of those budgets. So we've gone from that sparseness to these maps. But how confident are we about these maps? So the global community and ourselves have assumed that we are missing quite a lot by not being able to observe the scales that are missing in space and time from the ships. And there have been kind of a range of approaches. The US have used what we call our floats, or carbon-enabled floats, and these dive down to 1,000 meters every 10 days, or they surface every 10 days, should I say, from 1,000 meters, and measure CO2 through pH at the surface, as well as in the profile. And it's been a major investment, and it has really helped to close the time and space gap in the Southern Ocean. You can see the increasing redness, or the increasing number of months that are being covered. This was a major investment. This is big scale investment of something of the order of $300 million by the US. And this gives you a sense of how important this problem is judged globally. The SOCCO approach was more pinpoint, and that is, again, rather than going big scale, we said, well, let's see. So this is measuring every 10 days. And we say, well, let's measure at a much higher resolution than every 10 days at a particular location using ocean robotics. A third approach, which is more recent, is using what's called a sail drone. And this is an example of a circumpolar navigation that it did. So the sail drone is because it moves quite fast, is very good in space, whereas our wave gliders are very good in terms of looking at high resolution in time. So what we then did is and this is now the PhD work of Lai Deochuang, who has almost finished his PhD. And what we've done there is we're combining the high resolution modeling capability that we've developed through the CHPC, that's Biperion 12, which is a 10-kilometer resolution model, and we're combining it with a machine learning capability to sample that model as if to simulate the real world simulation across these 3 platforms. And these results, which are the first paper, is very close to, it's in review. And what it shows is these results here, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but this first little bit of the table simulates the existing ship-based observations. And the root mean squared error and the mean bias that we're getting is kind of pretty close to what we see from these global reconstructions that are being used at the moment, for example, in the IPCC, R1, CSIR ML6 being one of them. So they are really, we're simulating them here. What happens then when we add wave gliders and floats to the ship observations is across all the platforms is a very significant drop in the uncertainties and the biases relative to where if you just use ship-based data. So clearly we are missing some important aspects, temporal spatial aspects of the in terms of not having high resolution observations. Now, what is really interesting is if you have another experiment where all you do to the ship, oh, by the way, all of these experiments are being run in this little domain over here. We've actually extended it to the whole Southern Ocean, but these results are only about this domain. What is really interesting is that if you just add one more ship line in winter, okay, we ignore these ones for the time being, but conduct another experiment where to the summer observation, summer biased ship observations, we add one winter crossing. We see an impact on the root mean squared error and the bias, which is better than most of the autonomous platforms, except maybe the wave glider. The reason for that is that, and this is the major finding from this work from Lake's PhD, is that in order to really have an impact in reducing the uncertainty and the bias, we have to measure not just the CO2 variability at high resolution, which means wave glider, that's why the wave glider performs well, but also the meridional gradient of CO2, but north-south gradient, in other words, of CO2 and the seasonal cycle, because it varies seasonally. That gradient has a seasonal variability. So that changes completely the approach, and we've explained why this investment in floats is not achieving the objective that it's set out to achieve. And we're also explaining why this strategy here doesn't work. So we've proposed a new sampling strategy which will actually more than half the uncertainty and the bias of the CO2 flux, mean CO2 flux that's derived from those studies. So this work is in review at the moment. Okay, so just quickly, because time is, I'm almost finished. A third component, a really emerging component of our work that's related to CHPC infrastructure is this understanding of the changing contribution that the biological carbon pump has in the ocean. And why it's important is because the biological carbon pump, up to now, so up to this point, there's been no evidence of any changes in the biological carbon pump in the ocean. And the biological carbon pump is really important in the global the ocean carbon cycle, because it sets the long-term gradient of CO2 between the surface and the depth and the deep ocean. Now, the biological carbon pump would only be important to the contemporary anthropogenic CO2 uptake by the ocean if it could be shown that it was changing. And this is an important aspect of this dimension of the work that's being generated by the biological component of the SOCCO carbon cycle science. So SOCCO science has CO2 in physics and CO2 in biology, which does include physics as well. and this is now looking, so what we've been talking about up to now is a sort of CO2 physics aspect, and now we're talking about the biology aspect. And in developing these global products, our colleagues are now starting to point to a capability to starting to perhaps show that in fact there are trends in the biological carbon pipe. However, I have to say at this point that, as you can see, these trends over 20 years do not preclude decadal variability yet. So we can't say that these are long-term trends, but they are indicating that in fact trends do appear to exist in the biological carbon pipe. If this is indeed correct, it will have a significant, it could point to the biological carbon cycle becoming an important part of what I showed earlier were the positive feedbacks in the global carbon cycle. So to end, this is not just about science, and it's about nor about just computers, but about people. And these are sort of figures that sort of summarize the people component of, particularly in terms of students, how SOCCO has progressed over the past 10 to 12 years. So on the top left-hand side are our total number of PhDs and MSCs per year, and how they've been growing from 10 years ago to 18, and in fact it's over that now. But at the same time that the numbers have grown, so has the transformation aspect, and we're now sitting at around about 90% in terms of the students that we have. In terms of the excellence, with the number of publications, these have sort of grown from the sort of modest 2 to 3 per year to 13, and likely higher this year, with a consistently higher impact factor. Our contributions, so SOCCO Basic Science, as I showed in that figure in the beginning, not just limited to understanding, exploring science questions, but we do it because we have to answer important societal challenges. And we do that by contributing to national policy frameworks as well as international ones. So we are taking what we've learned and our capabilities that we've developed through our 10-year collaboration with CHPC, all the way from the basic science to societal impact. So the SOCCO Academy is something that we've put in place in the past few years. And that is really about being able to enable us to provide students who do not have an ocean and computing and coding background, and taking them on as interns for a period of 6 months before they register for their masters and PhDs. So some thoughts from Nicolette about trends that you might consider around in the coming years, and some of the needs that she foresees. So having a Jupyter hub, well, you can read it, I'm not to read it, but I mean the increasing role of GPUs and our increasing focus on parameterizations using both machine learning and process parameterization as well, in order to address that sub-grid scale problem in global Earth system models. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Monteiro. Thank you so much for a comprehensive talk and for your service and contributions to the science and education in South Africa. We want to wish you a prosperous and long retirement. At this point, I'll open, I know we're a bit over time, but I want to open it up to 1 or 2 questions before we let Dr. Monteiro go. You can unmute yourself and ask, or post the question in the chat box While we wait for those, I did have one. Oh, we have one from Dr. Janssen van Rensburg. Please continue, sir.
No, it's more like a comment. Thanks, Dr. Pedro. Thank you very much for this presentation. I must say, I really enjoyed it. You really put the focus areas and all the important parts of this science and research so well together. So thank you very much. It really helped me a lot to also understand many of the concepts we hear and some of the acronyms we see, but putting it all together in this context is really helpful. So thank you very much for this talk. And maybe just another comment. I'm taking serious note of especially that request for GPU resources. This is something that we are seeing not only from this domain area, but almost all domains, and it is expanding significantly the requirements for this. So we are taking note, and I hope that the CHPC will still be able to continue in supporting this group very well. We are, of course, planning a replacement cluster for Lingao is getting aged, and we will replace it with one significantly more power, but we recognize that the GPU component, and we will be ready for SOCCO requirements. So not really a question, but more a thanks. Thank you, Pedro.
Yeah, thanks, Varun. That's very nice to hear. Oh, and just going to Tetu's comment, I will never retire. A scientist does not retire.
Okay, all right. Oh, but we hope to see you around more now. And I had a question, but you had answered it. So I think at this point, we will not take up any more of your time. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day. Thank you to everybody who attended. We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.